There are moments that arrive unannounced, slipping through the careful architecture of your new routine, like water finding cracks in stone. This was one of them. I had been living with the aftermath for exactly 31 days. The apartment still bore the strange geography of a life half dismantled. A coat hook by the door held nothing but shadow now, its purpose suddenly abstract. On the kitchen counter, a coffee cup sat with the faint crescent of lipstick still marking its rim, not mine, but left behind like evidence of something I wasn't ready to wash away. In the trash beside my desk, a note lay crumpled and torn in half, its edges soft from handling. I had thrown it away 3 times and retrieved it twice. The third time, I simply left it there, a small rebellion against my own need for clean endings. These were the artifacts of our undoing, small and stubborn as grave markers. I had learned to navigate around them, the way you learn to favor an injured limb. Morning coffee became a ritual of careful avoidance. I used a different mug, took a different path through the kitchen, kept my eyes trained on safer territory. The apartment felt larger somehow, as if absence had its own square footage, its own gravitational pull. That Tuesday in early autumn, I was standing in my doorway with mail in one hand and my keys in the other when I looked up and saw him. Jonah. After a month of silence that had settled between us like sediment, there he was, not leaning against the wall as he used to, not checking his phone, not carrying the worn leather satchel that used to live by our door. Just standing there in the hallway, hands empty, looking at me with the same careful expression I remembered from hospital waiting rooms and difficult conversations. My first thought was absurdly practical. I wondered if he still had his key, if this was some elaborate way of asking for it back. My second thought dissolved into something more primitive, a recognition that bypassed logic entirely. This was the face I had memorized in 6 years of shared mornings, now strange and familiar in equal measure. He didn't ask to come in. He didn't apologize for appearing without warning. Instead, he said something that made the careful distance I had been building collapse like a house of cards. He said he remembered something he had never told me. The words hung in the air between us, and I realized I was holding my breath. This was how it had always been with Jonah. Moments of perfect stillness before revelation, like the pause between lightning and thunder. I had forgotten how he could create suspension with just a few words, how he could make the ordinary suddenly feel consequential. He hesitated then, and I watched something move across his face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the weight of whatever truth he had carried to my door. The silence stretched between us, thin and charged, and I understood that we were standing at the edge of something I had not prepared for. Something that would require more than the careful maintenance of separate lives, more than the neat divisions I had drawn around my days since he left. In that moment, suspended between his words and whatever would come next, I felt the first crack in the careful composure I had built around his absence. And somewhere in the space between us, in the familiar architecture of his face and the unfamiliar distance in his eyes, I recognized the shape of something I thought we had finished, something that had been waiting, patient as winter, for exactly this kind of return. 6 weeks before Jonah appeared at my door with his careful words and empty hands, I was still living in the fiction that our life together was simply going through a rough patch, the kind that couples weather with patience and good intentions. I was Adrian Montgomery, 43, senior architect at a firm that designed buildings people actually wanted to live and work in. My business cards were thick stock, my suits fit properly, and my project timelines rarely slipped. From the outside, my life had the satisfying weight of completion. My condo in Seattle's Capitol Hill looked like the pages of a design magazine that had been lived in just enough to feel authentic. The bookshelf was organized by subject rather than color, filled with architectural theory, a respectable collection of fiction, and cooking magazines I actually read. My record collection occupied 2 full shelves, vinyl I had been collecting since college, arranged alphabetically because Jonah used to tease me about my need for systems. The kitchen was clean but not sterile, functional but not sparse. This was a home that suggested a man who understood the relationship between form and beauty, who had learned to create spaces that nourished rather than merely sheltered. And until 6 weeks ago, it had been our home. Jonah Serrano was 37, though he carried himself with the careful economy of someone older. He was a landscape painter whose jeans were permanently marked with smudges of cadmium yellow and burnt umber, whose fingernails held the memory of every canvas he had touched. He painted the spaces between things, the light that falls between buildings at 4 in the afternoon, the shadow cast by a fence post in winter, the particular green that exists only in the hour before rain. His work sold occasionally, enough to supplement what I earned, enough to let him paint what mattered to him rather than what would certainly sell. We had been together for 6 years, a fact that surprised me when I counted it carefully. We had never married, had never felt the need to announce our commitment to the state or our families, but we had built something substantial nonetheless. We knew each other's sleep patterns and coffee preferences, had developed a shorthand for grocery lists and weekend plans. I knew that Jonah painted best in the morning light, that he grew quiet when he was working through a difficult passage, that he loved thunderstorms and hated crowds. He knew that I reorganized bookshelves when I was anxious, that I preferred cooking to eating out, that I called my sister Hannah every Sunday afternoon to check on her kids. The erosion began so gradually that I almost missed it entirely. Looking back, I can identify the first hairline cracks, conversations that felt like they were happening underwater, where we could see each other speaking, but the words arrived distorted and strange. Jonah would tell me about his day, and I would respond appropriately, but something essential was getting lost in translation. We began to occupy the same space without really meeting there, like two people reading different books in the same room. The silences grew longer and more deliberate. We would sit at dinner, the sound of cutlery against plates filling the space where conversation used to live. Jonah would finish eating and drift toward his easel, and I would wash the dishes alone, trying to convince myself that this was simply what it meant to be comfortable with someone. This absence of the need for constant chatter. But comfort, I learned, was not the same thing as connection. One evening in late summer, I found Jonah asleep on the couch, still wearing his painting clothes, a book splayed open on his chest. I covered him with a blanket and went to bed alone, assuming he would join me eventually. In the morning, he was gone. Not permanently, just out for coffee and a walk, but the couch held the impression of his body like evidence of a choice I had not seen him make. After that, the couch became his preferred territory. He would stay up late reading or sketching, and I would find him there in the morning, looking like a guest in his own home. When I asked if everything was all right, he would nod and say he had been having trouble sleeping, that he did not want to disturb me. I accepted this explanation because the alternative required a conversation I was not ready to have. Then, on a Thursday morning in September, I woke up and realized Jonah had not come home at all. His keys were gone from the hook. His coffee cup was clean and unused. I checked my phone for messages and found nothing. I called, and his voicemail answered in the voice I knew by heart, asking me to leave a message that I did not know how to compose. He returned that evening with groceries and an apology, saying he had stayed at his studio longer than intended, had fallen asleep there by accident. The explanation was reasonable, his tone was normal, and I chose to believe him because doubt required more energy than I knew how to spend. But something had shifted, and we both felt it. The apartment began to feel larger somehow, as if his absence had carved out new rooms I did not know how to navigate. I found myself going through motions that felt like echoes of a fuller life. Reheating coffee twice because I forgot to drink it the first time, checking my phone out of habit for messages that rarely came, pulling 2 wine glasses from the cabinet before remembering that dinner for one required different proportions. The condo grew colder, though the thermostat had not changed. I began wearing sweaters indoors, began closing doors that used to stay open, began living in smaller spaces within the larger space we had designed together. And through it all, Jonah moved like a careful guest, present but not quite settled, there but already somehow leaving. A week after Jonah stopped coming home entirely, the envelope arrived. It was waiting for me on the hall table, where Mrs. Chun from down the corridor always places mail that gets delivered to the wrong apartment. No return address, just my name written in handwriting I recognized, but had not seen in months. Jonah's careful script, the way he wrote grocery lists and birthday cards, each letter deliberate as brushstrokes. Inside was a single photograph, small and square like the Polaroids we used to take on weekend trips. But this was different, printed on regular photo paper, the kind you get developed at a drugstore. In it, Jonah stood barefoot in tall grass, his back to the camera, looking out toward a line of trees I recognized immediately. This was the field behind our old rental house in Walla Walla, the place we had lived during our second year together when I was working on a residential project outside the city. The house had been a compromise, too far from Seattle for my preference, too close to neighbors for his. But the rent was reasonable and the light was good for painting. Jonah had set up his easel in the spare bedroom that faced east, and I had used the kitchen table as a makeshift drafting space. We were playing house in the most literal sense, trying on the shape of a life together in a place that belonged to neither of us. I remembered the day this photograph was taken, though I could not remember taking it. It was late spring, and Jonah had been restless all morning, pacing between his easel and the window like something caged. After lunch, he had announced he was going for a walk and disappeared through the back door without asking if I wanted to join him. I had found him later in the field, standing exactly as he appeared in the photograph, still and contemplative, absorbed in whatever conversation he was having with the landscape. We had not been back to that house in years. The last I knew, it was still a rental, though I had heard from someone that the owners were considering selling. I stared at the photograph until my coffee grew cold, trying to understand what Jonah was telling me by sending it. Was this nostalgia? Regret? An invitation to remember when we had been happier, when the space between us felt bridgeable. I placed the photograph on the mantelpiece, propped against a small ceramic bowl I had made in college, a lopsided thing that Jonah used to tease me about, but that he had insisted we keep when we moved in together. The image looked strange there among my carefully curated objects, like evidence of a life I was not sure I was still living. 3 days later, I encountered Simone at Pike Place Market. She was a friend we shared, or perhaps more accurately, a friend of Jonah's who had always been generous enough to include me in her orbit. She sold jewelry at a booth near the flower vendors, intricate silver pieces that Jonah admired but I found too delicate for my taste. I was buying coffee when I spotted her arranging a display of earrings, her gray hair wrapped in a colorful scarf that somehow managed to complement everything and nothing in her inventory. She saw me approaching and smiled, though something in her expression suggested she knew more than she was prepared to share. We exchanged the usual pleasantries. How was work? How was the apartment? How was I doing since? And then she paused, studying my face with the directness that had always made me slightly uncomfortable. She said she had seen Jonah at an art show in Pioneer Square the previous weekend. He had been standing in front of a series of landscape paintings. She said, not the usual crowds in conversation kind of gallery opening, but something smaller and more intimate. She described him as looking thinner than usual, quieter, as if he were seeing the paintings through some private lens that excluded the rest of the room. He had not stayed long, she said. She had been on her way to greet him when she saw him slip out through the side door, disappearing into the evening before she could catch his attention. There was something in the way she told me this, careful and gentle, as if she were delivering news of a minor accident, that made me understand she was worried about him, about us, about whatever was happening between us that had left him wandering gallery openings alone. I thanked her for the information and bought a pair of silver cufflinks I did not need, a gesture that felt like payment for her concern. Walking home, I found myself taking the long route through downtown, past the galleries and coffee shops where Jonah and I used to spend weekend afternoons. Everything looked the same, but I felt like a tourist in my own city, someone visiting places that held significance for other people. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the buildings settling around me, to the neighbor upstairs practicing violin scales, to the distant hum of traffic on Pine Street. The photograph sat on the mantelpiece like a question I did not know how to answer, and eventually I gave up on rest and went to the living room to sit with it. In the closet, Behind winter coats and boxes of tax returns, I found the old file box where I kept letters and cards from before email replaced everything. I had not opened it in years, but my hands moved to it with the certainty of muscle memory. Inside, beneath birthday cards from my sister and postcards from work colleagues, I found what I was looking for: Jonah's first letter to me, written during our first summer together. It was dated July 15th, 6 years ago, written on heavy paper in his careful handwriting. I read it like a confession, like evidence of a crime I had forgotten committing. He wrote about the way morning light moved across my kitchen table, about how I made coffee with the precision of someone performing a ritual, about the particular shade of concentration that crossed my face when I was working on a difficult design problem. He wrote about feeling surprised by happiness, as if contentment were a country he had never expected to visit. Reading it again, I felt the sharp recognition of loss, not just of Jonah, but of the version of myself he had seen and captured in these careful sentences. When had I stopped being someone worth writing about? When had we stopped seeing each other clearly enough to find words for what we observed? A week later, I found myself driving east toward Walla Walla without having made a conscious decision to go. It was a Saturday morning, and I had told myself I was going for a drive to clear my head, maybe stop at some of the wineries we used to visit. But my GPS guided me directly to the old neighborhood, to the gravel driveway of the house, where we had tried on our first version of domestic life. The house looked smaller than I remembered, more weathered. A for rent sign tilted in the front yard, and the windows were bare of curtains or blinds. I parked on the street and walked around to the back, where the field stretched toward the tree line exactly as it appeared in the photograph. I stood in the doorway between the house and the field, not quite inside and not quite outside, trying to understand what had drawn me back to this place. The grass was taller now, gone to seed, and I could see the depression where deer had been bedding down. In the distance, the trees had grown fuller, creating deeper shadows than I remembered. I did not go into the field. I did not take any photographs. I simply stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, listening to the wind move through the tall grass, trying to remember what it had felt like to believe that Jonah and I were building something that would last. Then I walked back to my car and drove home, taking the highway instead of the scenic route, keeping this small pilgrimage to myself like a secret I was not ready to share with anyone, including myself. The silence that followed Jonah's words stretched between us like something physical, something I could almost reach out and touch. I remembered something I never told you. He stood in my doorway with that careful expression I knew so well, the one that meant he was measuring each word before he spoke it. And I realized I was still holding my mail, still wearing my jacket, still caught in the ordinary moment that his presence had suddenly made extraordinary. I stepped aside without deciding to, a gesture that felt like muscle memory. He hesitated at the threshold, as if entering required permission he was not sure he had earned, then crossed into the apartment with the particular awareness of someone revisiting a place that used to be home. I watched him take in the space, the coat hook with nothing hanging from it, the coffee cup with lipstick still marking its rim, the careful emptiness where his things used to live. He asked if I had tea, not coffee, which we used to share every morning, but tea. Something that suggested this was a different kind of conversation, something that required the slower ritual of steeping and waiting. I set the kettle to boil and found myself moving through my kitchen with the strange consciousness that comes from being observed by someone who knows your habits intimately. Jonah sat at the counter where he used to read the newspaper, but now he simply watched me measure loose leaves into the ceramic teapot his mother had given us during our second Christmas together. We talked around the edges of everything that mattered. I asked about his art, and he told me about a series he was working on, cityscapes painted from memory, he said, buildings and streets that no longer existed except in his imagination. He asked about my sister Hannah, and I found myself telling him about her promotion at the hospital, about how her youngest had started kindergarten and was already reading chapter books. We discussed what we had been reading. He had discovered a novelist I had never heard of, someone who wrote about loss and recovery with what he described as surgical precision. These were safe territories, familiar ground where we could meet without risking too much. But underneath the careful conversation, something else was happening. Jonah would catch my eye when he thought I was not looking, and I would find myself studying the line of his shoulders, the way his hands curved around the tea mug, the particular stillness he carried when he was thinking deeply. At one point, he reached across the counter to touch the edge of the ceramic bowl I had made in college, the lopsided thing he used to tease me about. His fingers traced the uneven rim with something that looked like tenderness, and he said quietly, almost to himself, that he had missed this. Not me, not us, not the life we had built together, but this imperfect object that somehow represented something essential about who I was before I learned to hide my mistakes. The admission hung in the air between us, small and significant as a seed. I did not know how to respond to it, so I simply watched him touch the bowl as if it were something precious, something he had forgotten he valued until he saw it again. He stayed for perhaps an hour, then left as quietly as he had arrived, with no explanation and no promise to return. I washed our tea mugs and put them away, then spent the evening trying to understand what had changed in the apartment since his visit. The space felt different somehow, not fuller, exactly, but less deliberately empty, as if his presence had reminded the rooms of their original purpose. Over the following weeks, he began to reappear, never with advance notice, never with explanation, never overnight. He would arrive in the early evening with a book he thought I might enjoy, or in the afternoon with questions about a project I was working on. Once, he brought me a scarf I had left at his studio months ago, still folded carefully in tissue paper, as if it were a gift rather than something I had simply forgotten. These visits felt tentative, fragile as new growth. We were both careful not to assume too much, not to push against whatever boundaries were slowly shifting between us. Jonah would sit in the chair by the window where he used to read on Sunday mornings, but now he perched on the edge as if ready to leave at any moment. I would offer coffee or tea, and he would accept gracefully but finish quickly, as if he were being mindful of overstaying whatever welcome he had earned. But something essential had changed in the air between us. The careful distance we had been maintaining was still there, but it felt different now, intentional rather than accidental, chosen rather than simply endured. When Jonah looked at me, I could see him actually seeing me, not looking through me or around me, but taking in whatever was actually there. And I found myself returning that attention, noticing things about him I had forgotten to observe. The way he gestured when he was excited about an idea, the particular quality of silence that meant he was working through something complicated in his mind. One evening, when he had been talking about a painting that was giving him trouble, I asked him directly what he was doing. Not why he was coming by, not what he wanted from these visits, but what he was actually trying to accomplish by returning to a space we had both learned to live without. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the early autumn light that was beginning to slant differently across the buildings. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of something he had been practicing, words he had been trying on in private before offering them to me. He said he was figuring out what he had been too afraid to say before. The answer was both more and less than I had expected. It suggested that our ending had been incomplete, that there were words that should have been spoken before we learned to live in separate silence. But it also suggested that he was not here to ask for forgiveness or to propose a simple return to what we had been. He was here to do the work of honesty, to excavate whatever truth had been buried under our careful politeness and mutual avoidance. I did not ask him to elaborate. I understood that whatever he was trying to say was still forming, still taking shape in whatever private space he carried his unspoken thoughts. Instead, I simply nodded, accepting his answer as both explanation and promise. When he left that night, I sat in the chair where he had been sitting and tried to imagine what it would mean to hear whatever words he was preparing to offer. The apartment felt different again, not empty, but full of possibility, as if we were both slowly learning to inhabit the space between what we had been and what we might become. The storm arrived on a Thursday night in October, the kind of Pacific Northwest rain that announces itself with wind and settles in for hours of steady percussion against windows and rooftops. I had been reading in bed, listening to the weather build outside, when I heard the knock at my door, not the tentative tap of recent weeks, but something more urgent, more necessary. I found Jonah standing in the hallway, completely soaked. His jacket was dark with water, his hair plastered against his forehead, droplets still falling from the hem of his jeans onto the carpet. He had no umbrella, no hood, no protection against the storm except whatever determination had brought him here through weather that sensible people waited out indoors. I let him in without questions, brought him a towel from the bathroom, offered him dry clothes that he declined with a shake of his head. He stood in my living room dripping onto the hardwood floor, looking around the space as if he were seeing it for the first time, or perhaps for the last time, with the particular attention we pay to places we are about to leave behind. For several minutes, he said nothing. He walked slowly through the apartment, past the bookshelf where his favorite novels still lived among mine, past the window where he used to stand drinking coffee in the morning light, past the ceramic bowl on the mantelpiece that held the small treasures of our shared life, ticket stubs and foreign coins, and the key to a rental car we had driven through Oregon wine country 3 summers ago. I followed his progress through the rooms without speaking, understanding somehow that this was a ritual he needed to complete, a way of saying goodbye to the geography of our shared history. When he finally stopped moving, he was standing by the kitchen counter where we had shared countless meals and conversations, where we had planned weekend trips and argued about grocery lists and worked through the small negotiations that accumulate into a life together. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a piece of paper, folded carefully into quarters. It was clearly old. The creases were soft with handling, the edges slightly worn, the paper itself yellowed in a way that suggested years rather than months. He held it for a moment, looking down at it as if he were reading something written on the outside, then looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not quite fear, not quite hope, but something suspended between the two. He told me he had written this letter 2 years ago, when he had first thought about leaving. The words came slowly, carefully measured, as if he were translating from a language he did not quite trust himself to speak fluently. He said he had carried it with him for months, had taken it out and refolded it countless times, had come close to giving it to me on at least a dozen occasions before losing his nerve and putting it away again. The letter was addressed to me in his careful handwriting, but the paper was soft with age and handling, and I could see that whatever it contained had been important enough to preserve but too difficult to share. He handed it to me without ceremony, without explanation beyond what he had already offered, and I understood that this was the truth he had been preparing to tell me, the words he had been too afraid to say. I unfolded it slowly, aware that we were crossing some threshold from which there would be no return to our careful politeness, our gentle avoidance of whatever had really happened between us. The paper crackled slightly as I opened it, and I could smell the faint scent of his studio, turpentine and coffee, and the particular mustiness of old buildings with good light. I read aloud, partly because the moment seemed to require witness, and partly because I needed to hear the words in my own voice to believe them. His handwriting was smaller than usual, cramped, as if he had been trying to contain something too large for the available space. The letter began with an apology for words he had never spoken, for conversations we had never had, for the distance he had been carrying like a weight between us. He wrote about feeling like an actor in a play he had never auditioned for, playing the role of someone else's idea of what a partner should be. He described intimate moments that had felt like performances, gestures of affection that had seemed choreographed rather than spontaneous, conversations about the future that had felt like lines he was reading from a script someone else had written. But underneath the fear and the performance, he had written about love. Real love. The kind that had terrified him more than loneliness, more than the prospect of spending his life alone, more than the small failures and disappointments that accumulate in any long relationship. He wrote about watching me make coffee in the morning and feeling overwhelmed by tenderness, about the way I reorganized bookshelves when I was anxious, and how that small ritual had become precious to him, about conversations we had shared in the dark before sleep, and how those words had felt more real than anything he said in daylight. He had loved me, he wrote, with a completeness that had made him feel transparent, as if I could see through all his careful defenses to whatever was most vulnerable and true about who he was. And that transparency had been both gift and terror, because it meant he could not hide from me the parts of himself he was still learning to accept. The letter ended with words I had to read twice to understand. He was not asking for forgiveness, not requesting a second chance, not proposing solutions to problems we had never properly named. He was simply offering the truth he should have given me years ago, the honesty that might have changed everything if he had found the courage to speak it when it mattered most. When I finished reading, I looked up to find Jonah crying quietly, not the dramatic tears of grief or anger, but something gentler and more exhausted, as if he had been carrying this weight for so long that its release left him empty and relieved in equal measure. He was not begging me to understand, not asking me to forgive him, not proposing that we try again. He was simply standing in my kitchen, soaked from the rain and finally, completely honest. The silence that followed felt different from any we had shared before. It was not the silence of avoidance or the silence of words withheld, but something cleaner and more spacious, as if the truth had cleared the air between us in ways that apologies or explanations never could. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and I understood that we were both changed by whatever had just passed between us, that we could never return to the careful distance we had been maintaining or the unconscious intimacy we had lost. We were somewhere new now, in territory neither of us had mapped, with only honesty to guide us forward. I woke the next morning to an apartment that felt emptied in a different way than it had for the past months. The silence was not the hollow absence I had grown accustomed to, but something more complete, the silence that follows a conversation that has changed everything, even when you are not yet sure what everything has become. Jonah was gone, of course. I had not expected him to stay, had not suggested it, had not even considered what it would mean to offer that kind of return to shared space. But beside the coffee maker, written on the back of an envelope in his careful handwriting, was a note that made my chest tighten with something I could not immediately name. I'll understand if that was goodbye. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of someone who had offered the most vulnerable parts of himself and was now prepared to accept whatever response that honesty deserved. There was no pressure in the note, no request for quick forgiveness or easy answers. Just an acknowledgement that truth-telling sometimes leads to endings rather than beginnings, and that he would accept whatever I decided his revelation had earned. I carried that note with me to work, tucked into my jacket pocket like a question I was not ready to answer. My colleagues noticed my distraction. I missed a client call, forgot about a meeting with the structural engineers, spent 20 minutes staring at blueprints without processing a single line or measurement. Architecture requires presence, attention to detail, the ability to see how small decisions accumulate into structures that will outlast their builders. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying the sound of Jonah's voice as I read his letter aloud, the particular quality of his tears, the way he had stood in my kitchen offering truth, like someone laying down weapons. When I tried to focus on the plans spread across my drafting table, I found myself thinking instead about the geography of love, about the careful engineering required to build intimacy that can withstand the weather of two separate people trying to create something together. Jonah had loved me, but he had also been terrified of that love, afraid that intimacy required him to disappear into someone else's idea of who he should be. And I had loved him, but I had also failed to see his fear, had mistaken his performance for contentment, had allowed our shared space to become a place where he felt like a stranger to himself. By evening, I had made no conscious decision about how to respond to his note. But when I left the office, I found myself walking not toward home, but toward Fremont, where Simone had mentioned Jonah was living now. I had never seen his new place, had never asked about it during his recent visits, but I knew the general area, and something in me seemed to understand exactly where to look. I found the building by following the smell of bread. It was a narrow brick structure wedged between a vintage shop and a used bookstore, with a bakery on the ground floor and what appeared to be apartments above. The windows on the second floor were lit, and I could see the edge of an easel, the corner of a canvas, the warm glow that meant someone was home, and working. I stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, trying to understand what I was doing there, what I intended to say if he let me in. The evening was cool and clear, and I could hear the sounds of dinner being prepared in neighboring apartments, the distant laughter of children playing in a nearby park, the comfortable bustle of a neighborhood settling into evening routines. When I finally climbed the narrow stairs and knocked on his door, Jonah answered immediately, as if he had been waiting by the window. He looked surprised but not shocked, tired but not unwelcoming. He stepped aside without speaking, and I entered a space that was smaller than I had imagined, but somehow more essentially his than our shared apartment had ever been. The studio was a single room with tall windows and good light, sparsely furnished but not empty. His easel stood near the largest window, surrounded by canvases in various stages of completion. A small kitchen occupied one corner, and a futon that clearly served as both seating and bed was positioned where he could see both his work and the street below. The smell of bread from the bakery below mixed with the familiar sense of paint and turpentine, creating something warm and complicated that felt like coming home to a place I had never been. We sat on the floor because there was nowhere else that felt appropriate for the conversation we needed to have. No music played, no wine was opened, no ritual of hospitality distracted us from the essential work of speaking honestly. Just the smell of bread baking below us and the sound of our own breathing in the space between words. I looked at him sitting cross-legged on the worn wooden floor, surrounded by the evidence of a life he had built in response to our ending, and I finally understood something that had taken me months to see clearly. I told him that he had not left because he did not love me. He had left because he did not know how to stay as himself. The words felt true as soon as I spoke them, and I watched recognition move across his face like light. He nodded slowly, not with relief, but with the quiet satisfaction of being seen accurately, of having his truth witnessed and understood rather than argued with or dismissed. And then I said something that surprised even me, words that seemed to come from some part of myself I had not known was listening. I told him I did not know if we got to fix this, but I did not want to keep pretending I was fine without trying. The admission hung in the air between us, and I realized that this was not a promise. It was not a reconciliation or a return to what we had been, or even a clear path forward. It was simply an acknowledgement that the work of love sometimes requires us to begin again with different tools, to build something new on the foundation of what we have learned about ourselves and each other through the process of failing. Jonah looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him taking in the weight of what I had offered. Not certainty, not forgiveness, not even hope, exactly, but something more careful and more honest. The willingness to try to understand what it might mean to love each other without requiring either of us to disappear in the process. Outside, the bakery was closing for the night, and we could hear the sounds of cleanup, the scrape of chairs being stacked, the gentle thud of the cash register drawer being closed. Somewhere in the building, a neighbor was practicing piano, working through the same passage repeatedly until the melody became familiar. And between us, in the small space we had created with our honesty, something new was beginning to take shape. Fragile as new growth, uncertain as any beginning, but real in the way that only truth can be real. Several weeks later, I woke to sunlight streaming through windows that no longer felt like monuments to absence. The apartment was still mine, my name on the lease, my furniture arranged according to my preferences, my coffee routine unchanged in its essential rhythms. But something fundamental had shifted in the quality of the space, as if the rooms had remembered how to breathe. On the wall beside my bookshelf, where once there had been only the ghost marks of removed pictures, hung one of Jonah's paintings. Not one of his landscapes, but something newer, a study in light and shadow that he had been working on during our weeks of careful conversation. He had brought it the previous Sunday, not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet offering, asking if I thought it might work in that particular spot. I had said yes, and we had hung it together, measuring twice and marking the wall with the same precision I brought to architectural drawings. We were not living together. That felt important to name, to hold space for the difference between what we were building now and what we had been before. Jonah still kept his studio above the bakery, still woke to the smell of bread and the sounds of a neighborhood that was learning to be his. I still lived in the rhythm of my own routines, still enjoyed the particular solitude of morning coffee and evening reading, still valued the way my spaces reflected my own choices and preferences. But we had begun to orbit each other again, carefully and intentionally. Tuesday evenings, Jonah would arrive with takeout from the Thai place we had discovered during our first year together, and we would eat at my kitchen counter, talking about our work and the books we were reading and the small observations that accumulate into intimacy. Thursday afternoons, I would sometimes stop by his studio, bringing coffee and the newspaper, sitting quietly while he painted or worked through problems on canvas that had no words. On Sundays, we walked the waterfront together, not holding hands. That felt too much like returning to old scripts, old assumptions about what closeness should look like, but not avoiding touch either. Sometimes our shoulders would brush as we paused to watch the ferries crossing Elliott Bay. Sometimes our fingers would tangle briefly when one of us pointed out something in the distance. A seal surfacing near the pier, the particular way afternoon light caught the mountains across the sound. These walks had become our rhythm, our way of being together without the weight of shared domestic space, without the pressure of performing intimacy we had not yet fully rebuilt. We would buy coffee from the vendor near Pike Place and walk north toward Myrtle Edwards Park, past the sculpture garden and the grain terminal, past joggers and dog walkers, and other couples finding their own ways of being together in public spaces. We talked during these walks, but not constantly. There were stretches of comfortable silence, moments when we simply moved through the city together, breathing the salt air and watching the water change color as clouds moved across the sun. Sometimes Jonah would stop to photograph something. The way barnacles clustered on pier pilings, the geometric shadows cast by construction cranes, and I would wait, patient with his need to capture light and texture in ways I was still learning to see. In my desk drawer, carefully filed between tax documents and insurance papers, I kept the letter he had given me that rainy October night. I did not read it often. Its words had settled into my understanding like sediment, becoming part of the foundation rather than something that required constant examination. But I did not throw it away either. It felt important to preserve this artifact of honesty that had opened the door between who we had been and who we were becoming. One particular Sunday in November, we returned from our walk to find my apartment filled with the golden light that comes just before winter settles in for good. Jonah made tea while I sorted through the mail, and we settled into the rhythm we had been developing, not the old patterns of shared domestic life, but something newer and more intentional. I watched him move through my kitchen with the particular carefulness of someone who was no longer taking access for granted, who understood that presence was a gift to be honored rather than an assumption to be relied upon. When he handed me my mug, our fingers touched briefly, and neither of us moved away immediately. Such small gestures had become significant, not because they were rare, but because they were chosen. We sat by the window as the light began to fade, our mugs side by side on the sill, steam rising from the tea and mingling in the air between us. Outside, the city was settling into evening, lights coming on in apartments across the neighborhood, people returning home from their own Sunday rituals and adventures. We did not speak for a long time. There was no need to fill the silence with conversation, no pressure to perform intimacy or connection we did not feel. We simply sat together, two men who had learned the difference between presence and performance, between love and the fear of love, between the intimacy that requires us to disappear and the intimacy that allows us to remain ourselves while choosing, again and again, to share space with another person. When full darkness finally settled over the city, Jonah gathered his jacket and prepared to return to his own space, his own evening routine, his own rhythm of solitude and creation. But before he left, he paused in the doorway and looked back at me sitting by the window, and something passed between us that had no words, recognition, perhaps, or gratitude, or simply the quiet acknowledgement that this was what we were building now, not the fiction of seamless togetherness, but the more difficult and more honest work of learning to love each other while remaining whole.